And it's also an exciting moment for me kind of to speak about, say a few words about my recent book about an intellectual biography of Isaiah Berlin, cover of which you can see here. And I need to clarify straight away that I'm not a philosopher, neither a political scientist. Actually, I was trained, Noam knows my doctoral father was always quoting W.H. Auden, said, "Thou shalt not commit social sciences." And I am a historian, and I really want to put it out front from the beginning, because my theoretical intervention, if you'd like, is best defined as contextualist. I want to put Berlin in a specific context, and it's a complex context. And in the book, I call it the type of approach that we need to apply. I define it in the book as kind of as a double perspective that puts Berlin on the one hand in a very British liberal tradition, but that was many times done. That was the kind of the common or the cliche or the automatic way of reading Berlin, but at the same time puts him in a modern Jewish history perspective, and particularly sees him also as a very active participant in Zionist politics in very crucial phases. And I think that this double perspective is also one of the ways to unfold one of the major conceptual tensions that one finds in Berlin's political philosophy. And this is, in a way, what happened to the reception of Berlin's political ideas in the few recent years. For many years, Berlin was seen as predominantly the thinker that defends a negative conception of liberty. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. And it was seen as probably the most influential liberal thinker of the 20th century. But little by little, interpreters and commentators realized that Berlin has more than one thing to say, and that he was also writing extensively about what he called counter-Enlightenment thinkers, defending cultural nationalism, and people found it very disturbing. How can it be that he says more than one thing? And this refers to my earlier comment. Many times what I found in the literature that is offered to us by political thinkers and philosophers was that if they acknowledged this tension, they saw it as a challenge and as a problem that you need to solve. And they wanted to come with a systematic Berlinian legacy that each one of us can put in the pocket, solve the tensions, solve the dilemmas and the problems, and take a Berlinian philosophy with you. And part of what I'm trying to say is that, no, I want to understand where these tensions grew from, why we have such a contradicting philosophical apparatus. In a way, Berlin attracts me exactly because he's not systematic, because there are so many cracks and tensions. And this is what I would try to unfold in a historical way in this talk. Now, to talk about Berlin and Jewish nationalism in the same, put them in the same sentence is not really the conventional way of looking at Berlin. Berlin's reputation lies elsewhere, of course. His philosophy, he's primarily known and familiar to us as in British liberal intellectuals, the president of the British Academy at one stage, the founding president of Wilson College at Oxford. And whenever I give this talk in a more British setting, I always remind everyone that it was also known as a man of great society wit, which is really important to understand this social climber. But what I would like to remind us is really that there is another Berlin. It's the same Berlin, but there's a second side to the coin, which is the East European Jewish emigre that had a very long and intimate relationship with the Zionist movement, and this is my way of saying, don't think about it as separate layers of Berlin's identity. And this is an expression that was used by one of his former commentators, but really I think that there is actually a very interesting tension between these layers that will explain in a better way why Berlin comes with the ideas he comes with. So what I would try to do in the in the next half an hour or so is to tell you a story. And I divided my talk into 3 unequal parts. And the first part, which will provide your kind of the biographical sketch of Berlin's formative years, it will also show you how ambivalent was his approach to Zionism. And this is the narrative part of the talk, so I hope you will enjoy it. So sit back and enjoy the ride. But then I will try to move to a more kind of a philosophical part of my talk, and I will argue that from this story you can really understand how Berlin came to conceptualize freedom and liberty as what I call an opportunity concept. And that actually from his Zionist, from these Zionist dilemmas, he came to think about freedom in a very new and unusual way that you cannot find in the traditional British liberal thought. And in the conclusion, I will try to refer to the question that is hinted in the title of my talk today: what is Jewish about this philosophy? Whether we should describe it as a Jewish political philosophy, yes or no, and how what is the relationship between these two things? So that's kind of the roadmap of what I'm about to do. It's a concept that was kidnapped by awful politicians, but this is what we'll try to do. So, Isaiah Berlin, or Isaiah Mendelovich Berlin. Isaiah Berlin was born in 1909 in the Baltic port city of Riga. Now it's the capital of Latvia. Then was a very important port city in the Russian Empire with a very strong influence of the German Baltic culture, and was a son of a prosperous timber merchant and also a direct descendant of the Hasidic dynasty of Chabad. He was a really true blue-blooded Schneerson, which is a very interesting mix. And this is a family that comes from a very interesting background. I won't go into it, but this is kind of the site of Berlin's birth. This is Berlin's hometown, and this is the famous Albertstrasse in Riga. Till nowadays, a very famous street because it's a kind of a Art Nouveau street. And I wanted you to see this image to remind you that this is not the classic Hasidic background that one sometimes assumes that the Schneers are bringing with them. This is a relatively wealthy family that has connections through their merchant ties with other areas, multilingual context. And in a way, although exposure to Judaism was there and was intimate, was part of the household, Russification and cultural exposure to the German Baltic high culture influenced Berlin's intellectual appetites much more than traditional Judaism as a young kid. It is interesting, especially because when Berlin later immigrated to England, he would still keep on insisting that there was still something very deep-rooted in his Jewish identity. And this is something that it could never be erased by conversion or assimilation. I know that I am a Russian Jew from Riga, and all my years in England cannot change it. He declared and reiterated this idea in so many ways, so many times. He never really defined what exactly is this thing. But if you look at the sarcasm and the irony and the bitter, biting comments about either assimilated Jews or Jews that are shying away from their questionable ethno-religious roots, you can see that there is a very strong ethnic dimension to the way he perceived this Jewish identity. And after a very short and dramatic sojourn in revolutionary Petrograd, the Berlins immigrated in 1921 to Britain, and Isaiah Berlin was sent to St. Paul's School. And his love affair with Oxford University, his true sort of cultural home, began in 1928. Young Isaiah attended Corpus Christi College, and in 1932 became the first Jew to be elected to the All Souls College Prize Fellowship that was still till today is considered probably the highest academic honor in the British academic life. It also started a long list of amusing mistakes when one of the things I've found in the archive is, of course, a letter from the chief rabbi congratulating Irving Berlin for his remarkable achievement, and this mistake will repeat itself time and again. In the wartime years, Winston Churchill will invite, by mistake, Irving Berlin to lunch, thinking this is Isaiah Berlin. So there's another persona there in the background all the time. But really, from the second that he becomes kind of this first Jew to enter All Souls College, he becomes a bit of an iconic icon, especially for the Anglo-Jewish community. Now, formally, Berlin, as an academic those years, was interested in a very rigorous type of analytic and linguistic philosophy, but at the same time, he did evince kind of an early interest in political philosophy. He was part of a circle that was of Oxford dons that called themselves the Pink liberals, following or inspired by G.D.H. Cole, the famous socialist thinker. And he spent more than 3 years writing an intellectual biography. So for me, as someone who wrote an intellectual biography, it's a nice thing. An intellectual biography of a certain guy named Karl Marx. And this biography comes out in September 1939, really several days after England declares war on Nazi Germany. And he spent the wartime years as a diplomat, first in New York City and the British Information Services, and later at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., where he really reached the pinnacle of the embassy, becoming the first secretary of the embassy. And part of his responsibilities was to draft weekly reports about the American political scene. And Winston Churchill famously was very impressed by these reports, and again asked to meet Berlin, and found himself meeting Irving Berlin. Nevertheless, after the war, they did meet, and there was a friendship between the two, a very asymmetrical friendship, of course, but it's a very important phase in Berlin's intellectual formation, because it also kind of pushed him towards a new type of Cold War orientation. And this is really this is part of what is so remarkable about Berlin after the war. He's able to transcend this Oxonian circle and really shape himself or fashion himself as a transnational Cold War intellectual, writing in widely read magazines, not necessarily academic publications, such as Encounter, that nowadays we know that was clandestinely supported by CIA funds. Was the host, was a kind of a regular speaker on the BBC's third program. And this is really something that is remarkable, because this, on the one hand, it allowed Berlin to become the icon of the British intellectual. But if you ever have the chance to hear a recording of Berlin, and nowadays we can do it with all the YouTubes and the recordings that are available online, you will hear not only a very thick East European accent, but also a very rapid talk, not an easy chap to follow. Actually, one of the famous gags in Oxford at the time was that Berlin was probably the only person in the world that can pronounce the word epistemological as if it's one syllable. And it's not easy to follow it, but somehow he became his lectures became the big show in town, and he was the guest in all the fancy dinner parties, and I think this is also something you should remember in the background. Now, when it comes to Berlin and Zionism, it's very hard to put the finger or pinpoint a specific moment or event that pushed him to Zionism due to the simple reason that, in a way, Berlin is a cradle Zionist. He came from a family of Zionist sympathizers, and his uncle his aunt from one side was Zhenya Berlin. You can see her here, was married to no other than Yitzhak Sadeh, the architect of the Palmach, the nucleus of the future Israeli Defense Forces, immigrating to Palestine, very Zionist. His other aunt was married to a lesser known but not less important person, Yitzhak Samunov, who was the secretary of the Jewish community, Vada Kehillah, in mandatory Jerusalem, meaning someone who is sitting in the very crucial meeting point between the Jewish agency and the British mandatory administration. And Berlin always assumed that there is a clear connection between his Jewish background and his decision to support this form of nationalism. However, and this is not typical of many Anglo-Jews at the time, he did not conceive himself as the one who was expected to fulfill the Zionist dream of immigrating to Zion. He regarded Zionism as a humane, fair solution to a refugee problem or to persecuted Jews. And I tend to call this sort of Zionism using the term vicariousness. And by vicariousness, I mean that one could really adopt an emotional and even ideological identification with the goals of the World Zionist Organization, but on the basic premise that he himself would not be expected to fulfill this dream of returning to Zion. And of course, the famous joke about a good Zionist being a Jew that pays a second Jew to convince a third Jew to immigrate to Israel or Palestine captures it in a humorous way. But Zionism was not only a family business. It was also a political discourse, if you'd like, or a political language. And this is where another interesting, fascinating figure, a bit of a forgotten figure, enters into our story, and this is Louis Namier. Louis Namier, I don't know how many of you have heard of the name Louis Namier. Those of you who are students of British history should immediately recognize the name as the one who revolutionized the way we understand 18th century English history. He was actually a Galicianer, born as Ludwig Nemirovsky to a Polish Jewish family. Again, a relatively wealthy family that had a landed aristocratic family, and this is an important and it's an important fact to remember, because for Namier, the way he read English history, there was always a very strong emphasis on the importance of landedness, of attachment to landedness, and what humans gain by owning a specific plot of land and calling it their own. And this is very interesting, and I won't go into details about the way that Namier started to read British history and English history. For him, English history is not about abstract ideas, it's not about the centralized government, it's not about the crown and the king, it's really about the gentry owning things and creating these corporations. But this is really interesting that he takes some of these ideas and incorporates them in a very hawkish Zionist outlook. And Namier was one of the most outspoken British Zionists at the time. He was a fierce critic of what he described or saw as a sickly condition of the exilic Jew. Jews should transform themselves mentally by attaching themselves to a territory, and only by doing so they will become, in so many words, normal. And he was really insisting on this time and again, and there was really a strong emphasis in his writing on the state of the diaspora Jew as being quintessentially characterized by a psychological damage. And I mentioned Namier because Berlin is not only close to him, but reads him very early on. Berlin, at the very same time that Berlin was cultivating his witty and conversational style, Namier, that as this photo can hint was a very angry person, was actually angering everyone in infamous in his kind of confrontational manner, arguing this. And Berlin was negotiating between these two things, and you can see in young Berlin a very fierce very Neymerian, if you'd like, criticism of assimilation and really acceptance of some of these ideas that assimilation creates these sickly hybrids. And the political crisis of the 1930s really makes these arguments poignant. Just to give you a flair or a sense of the Neymerian discourse, this is a short excerpt from the introduction he writes in 1933 to the English translation of Arthur Pin's famous book on the sociology of the Jews. Our position in the world is anomalous, difficult, often ambiguous. We must now undergo a fundamental process of economic reorientation, but we have neither the resources of the state nor the place wherein to effect it. Our firstmost endeavor should be directed towards fighting the Luftmensch. This untranslatable term describes men without solid ground under their feet, without training or profession, without capital or regular employment, living in the air, and it would almost seem on air. And from this analysis, Neymar really deduced his Zionism, that if you want to summarize it in a quick formula, the Jewish aching soul can be cured only by attachment to a specific soil. And it's a very interesting thing. What Neymar does not talk about until the late 1930s, however, is a state. This hawkish Zionist philosophy of life, this Lebensphilosophy, is not going hand in hand with the idea of a state apparatus. In fact, Neymar would be one of the most enthusiastic supporters of a now more or less forgotten idea of turning Palestine into the seventh dominion of the British Commonwealth, meaning sovereignty is not the name of the game here, but really this sort of normalization discourse is one of the interesting things that we find in this sort of philosophical approach to Zionism. And this is one of the types of Zionist discourse that Berlin is influenced by at a very early formative stage, and this is even before he meets Chaim Weizmann. Now, we don't have the exact sources that allow us to determine, for instance, whether Berlin supported the Seventh Dominion scheme or not, but there's no doubt that he was exposed to this kind of philosophy that emphasizes the radical aspiration to reshape Jewish thinking and behavior and produce this new Hebraic man and culture in Palestine. But on this issue, Berlin, like a good British intellectual, was skeptical. And it was not only skeptical, it was very ironic. And one of the remarkable things you can see where you can find this irony is really in his private letters and his vast correspondence. A fascinating correspondence can be found related to the trip that Berlin does, his first trip to Palestine in 1934, in which he wittingly and ironically exemplifies really many of these misgivings. He comes to Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv of the time is, of course, the flagship of the Zionist movement, the first Hebrew city in the world, and he's utterly unimpressed. The rapid construction in Tel Aviv, he says, is described by him as an ugly city of Jewish gold diggers, a Jewish Klondike filled with noisy, dirty streets, too narrow because of dearth of room, too hectic, way too oriental for his state. He reaches the conclusion time and again in letters to his parents that what he sees in Palestine convinces him that Jews have no taste. And these are his words, not mine. But the issue was not only a certain lack of aesthetic sensibility on Jews' behalf, as much as the idea that this sort of exilic mentality would not simply disappear once Jews would relocate themselves to the shiny, sunny new land of Palestine. And indeed, his observations are also about East European Jews were very unflattering as well. The Jewish officials, he writes in one letter, referring explicitly also to his own relatives, are the rudest people on earth, a mixture of chutzpah and inferiority complex. And similar misgivings you find in many other letters, and the same They show that he really believed that Jews would not be are not capable of ridding themselves of these mental shackles associated with the old ghetto mentality simply by moving to the Mediterranean. And it is interesting because this is where, Michael Ignatieff, when he wrote Berlin's kind of semi-official biography, was very amazed to find a Jew uttering such ironic and sardonic remarks, and he could not hold himself but say that Berlin was poisoned by Jewish self-hatred. Now, the problem I find with this sort of reading is not only that it really employs a quite meaningless category of analysis, but it really does not understand the historical context in which these comments were uttered. It's not only that we need to bring into the picture this normalization discourse that Berlin was influenced by, but also the British colonial context, the political context in which these comments are uttered. And this is because Berlin's perspective in the early 1930s is still predominantly a British colonial one. The British Empire is parenting Jews towards their political maturity. The Jews are maybe the more advanced or even the best students in class for him, but nonetheless they're still students. And a good example can be found in one of the letters that he writes to Justice Felix Frankfurter and his wife, describing the political triangular of Jews, Brits, and Arabs in Palestine. Berlin used explicitly this metaphor of the English public school to describe the situation in Palestine. And this is how he describes the Jewish house. The Jewish pupils were abler and richer than other boys, allowed too much pocket money by their parents, rude, conceited, ugly, ostentatious, suspected of swapping stamps unfairly with the other boys, always saying they know better, liable to work too hard and not play games with the rest, and it continues on. And this fear of ghetto mentality will not disappear even after 1937, as the Palestine Partition Plan would be offered by the Peel Commission, when Berlin will write again to Judge Felix Frankfurter, once again with humor, but not entirely in irony. I hope you can see the slide. Can you conceive the consequences of the Peel report? One enormous cylindrical town from Haifa to Tel Aviv of talit sellers with a fashion for bar mitzvah boys to be confirmed in the Holy Land, and a nation of Jewish hotel keepers and souvenir vendors to receive them. That is what a nation of 1.5 million will certainly become. I expect I'm quite wrong. It will really be a soundly Blut and blood and soil, as say Luxembourg. Now, I'm using these quotes really to show you how Berlin's ambivalence and not only his witty style, but really to call your attention to this type of reading that one needs to bring into this type of personal correspondence. And it was soon after writing this letter that Berlin met for the first time Chaim Weizmann, the charismatic president of the World Zionist Organization, the future first president of the State of Israel, and a person to whom Berlin would dedicate quite a number of essays and lectures. Weizmann at the time was looking for a new blood to revitalize his movement, and Berlin, who admitted in his writings that he was seduced by this irresistible political seducer, was a prime candidate. In fact, thanks to the opening of Berlin's archives, we already know that Berlin started cooperating with the Zionists earlier on, many times through his family connections. But it's quite clear that Weizmann was able to take Berlin pro-Zionist sentiments and intensify them. And some of the ambiguity is hushed in a way. Now, it was not simply powerful personality, but also the Weizmannite ideology that attracted Berlin. Weizmann Zionism did not contradict the British imperial ideology of the time as much as it relied on it. Weizmann Zionism was diplomatic rather than messianic, practical and gradual, and always downplaying the rhetoric of an utopian nation building. And it stressed time and again the vital importance of collaboration and cooperation with the English mandatory policy. And this was also was compounded by Berlin's own conception of himself as East European Jew, and he always admired the fact that Weizmann was a Volksmensch, someone who's coming from the Pale of Settlement, but at the same time is able to speak with the British on the same level. And here we have a very interesting episode that Berlin is tied to. Lord Spill Royal Commission of Inquiry, whose members are photographed in the slide before you, is central in this respect. As you know, the commission was set up in order to look into the reasons of the Arab-Jewish hostilities of 1936 and to recommend substantial changes in the British policy. And this is the committee that would, in July 1937, present the famous partition plan. Now, how is this crucial historical episode is connected to Berlin? Part of what we see is really the social network in operating. One of the letters I was very happy to uncover is really the letter in which Berlin informs the Zionists through his uncle exactly who's who on the Peel Commission of Inquiry. It's not only a list of names that he sends the Zionists before the official names are declared, but it also provides a very short biographical details about each one of those members, warning the Zionists who is more likely to be in favor of the Zionist claims and who is the rotten anti-Semite or British imperialist that will not that will be a harder nut to crack. And this is important because everyone knew at the time that both Chaim Weizmann and Haj Amin al-Husseini, Jerusalem Muftis, will be asked to give testimonies in front of the commission. Now, there's an ironic twist to the entire story because the person that Berlin will warn everyone from is this person, Reginald Copeland, debate professor of colonial history at Oxford University, and, like Berlin, a fellow of All Souls, a professor that really made his career interwoven with the faith of the empire and a strong supporter of the British Commonwealth and a member of the what was then a famous circle of roundtable thinkers. There's an ironic twist to the story because actually, eventually, Copeland became highly sympathetic of the Zionist arguments, and according to many historians, assume that he was the one responsible of drafting the chapters about the Yishuv in Palestine. Nevertheless, maybe it was exactly these sort of WikiLeaks information that Berlin supplies the Zionists that allowed Weizmann and the others to really focus their attention on Reginald Copeland and do such a strong, good job of convincing him about the Zionist move. So this is part of the kind of universe and social world that Berlin is coming from, and this is what he brings into his Zionist politics. I don't want to talk in length about Berlin's involvement activities during World War II, but it is really important to remember that what happens in World War II really, again, intensifies Berlin's ambivalence. Now Berlin finds himself in, as I've mentioned, in America, and many times find himself stuck in between two very contradicting currents. His official position is at the British Embassy puts him under Lord Halifax, the famous architect of the appeasement that was kicked out from office by Winston Churchill to this cozy exile in Washington. Again, a fellow of All Souls that Berlin knows very well from his pre-war life. But at the same time, his job is to start learning who's who on the American political scene, and he starts learning the Jewish community, and he meets a sort of new type of Zionist current that he feels very disturbed by, with a new type of rhetoric that is amplified by figures like Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver and others. And here Berlin was not very different from many other Foreign Office officials at the time. He saw the American Zionists as a vocal minority among a deeply divided public of American Jewry, a group of propagandists and demagogues that were willing to risk an anyhow shaky Anglo-American alliance for the sake of a very narrow particularistic case. In my views, the Zionist tactics, he writes in one letter, is very dangerous. They have irritated the State Department to a degree. I should imagine that the president is really displeased and they are bound to pay us this for sooner or later. And the State Department hates them more than communists now, he writes to friends and family. And I emphasize this because this is not Berlin moving away from Weizmann's Zionism as much as Berlin calling Weizmann. You don't understand that now the nerve system moved from Great Russell Street in London to Washington. Move your headquarters here. This is where the big business is being done. And this is where Berlin really starts believing even more in Weizmann. There is really was value in Weizmann's presence here since the Zionists, with their 92% majority and no Weizmann, may really do something silly. He writes to his parents in a different letter, the Jews continues in a state of combined cowardice and indignation, which is the worst immoral combination. Now, I remind you that part of what is standing in the background of this Zionist extremism is, of course, the news about the extermination of Jews in Europe. And here Berlin plays a very interesting role, and I won't go into this. But it is really interesting to see how during the war, Berlin actually becomes more disenchanted by Zionist politics. And this is what helps him to make up his mind about his future academic career. On the first day after the European war is over, Berlin wrote in one letter, I shall probably make a frantic attempt to return to Oxford. And this is exactly what he did. And from that stage on, Weizmann's attempts to bring the intellectual that he felt he was grooming back into the Zionist circle were unsuccessful because Berlin really wanted to take a step back. Weizmann himself felt that Berlin was taking a step, moving away from the Zionist movement at the most crucial moment in modern Jewish history, but there was nothing he could do apart from remarking in a very sarcastically that with his return to the secure status of an Oxford Don, Isaiah should write a book in 4 volumes and footnotes longer than the text in such a style that no more than 20 people in the world would be able to understand it. Once you get that out of your system, you can go on writing brilliant articles without being considered superficial, said Weizmann. And this was an episode that Berlin felt very bad about. It haunted Berlin for years. He later hinted that he carried a considerable amount of guilt, but it was clear there was a gap, and the gap was quite unbridgeable. How is it related to Berlin's analysis of nationalism? Well, Berlin continues to be involved in Zionist politics despite that. But what he sees is not only that he himself is now trying to take a step back, but also that Zionism itself transforms itself into an anti-colonial national liberation movement. And the anti-British activities in Palestine after the war alienate him. The wave of violence, of course, every time reached another peak. Lord Moyne's assassination is a famous case, but also probably from the British perspective, the Zionist brutality reached its climax with the bombing of the King David Hotel, the seat of the British military command and the government secretariat in July 1946. Now, this is a fascinating episode that really can show you how much Berlin is a reactive thinker. At the same time that these waves of violence in Palestine were reaching new peaks, Berlin was drafting a very long letter which is a bold defense of Zionist politics. I found this, many variations of this letter in the archives. He even asked Weizmann himself to comment on the letter and says to him, I have written a long letter to the Times about Palestine. There are some moments when silence is shameful, and then he adds in Russian, "Nie могу молчать," I cannot keep silent. Whenever Berlin wanted to be sentimental, we'd add something in Russian. Now, I went to the Times archives, and no such letter appeared. Nothing. And this is really, and it took me quite a while to solve this jigsaw puzzle, and then I realized that what really happened is that Berlin was about to send this letter, and he most literally pulled away from the post office box when he heard the news from Palestine about the King David Hotel being bombed. And I mentioned this episode because I want you to understand to what extent we have a thinker that really has his finger, on the pulse of the activities in Palestine and how this affects him. But also because what this moment, I think, is pushes Berlin to think about is really about the way these noble ideas about nationalism can quickly deteriorate or transform themselves into very violent activities. And if you will read later on the way that Berlin will write about nationalism, he will do something that is very interesting. On the one hand, unlike the typical British liberal that we would assume that will emphasize only the role of the individual, he will emphasize that no one is a Robinson Crusoe, that humans need a community, that people need to feel that they are part of a nation, and they will talk about Jews as a nation. But at the same time, he will be an ardent critique of what he started to call pathological nationalism. And this is a really one of the things that I think is rooted in his intimate involvement in the Zionist politics. And we have very good documents that can show us how he thought about Zionism. And maybe the last case that he had an opportunity to influence Zionist politics came in 1946, a few months after this bombing, when now Chaim Weizmann asked Berlin to comment on something that he was preparing, his speech in front of the 22nd Zionist Congress, the famous post-Holocaust Congress, in which Weizmann gave a very bold speech in which he was not willing to subscribe to the new anti-colonial terrorist tactics. Now, when you compare the original draft and the comments by Berlin, you can see that Berlin really, thanks to Berlin's comments, Weizmann really added a very decisive paragraph to this speech, which is a bold paragraph in which he rejects terrorism. In the original draft, Weizmann says, terrorism is simply counterproductive. It's impractical as a tactic of struggle. No, following Berlin, Weizmann comes and says that actually Zionism is exactly this type of national movement that cannot have this sort of dark shade to it. Zionism was a movement without a chauvinistic side, and this is part of this newly added paragraph. It is quite futile to invoke the national struggles of other nations as examples of ourselves. We are not only the circumstances or differences, but also our purposes too are unique. We are left with the task of weighing our actions in the scales of the Jewish tradition. Nor must our judgment be dazzled by the glare of self-conscious heroism. And see in particular what he does in the next sentence and how he refers to Metzada or Masada, the famous site where the zealous Sikari rebels preferred mass suicide rather than surrender to the Roman troops. Masada, for all our heroism, was a disaster in our history. Weizmann, following Berlin, concluded his speech. So this is really one of those decisive moments. Those of you who are familiar with Zionist history will know that this was a huge fiasco. Weizmann, following this speech, was not re-elected president of the World Zionist Organizations. The protocols of the Congress really show us that he was booed and asked to step down. And I think that this is a crucial moment because he not only regarded Weizmann's failure as a political defeat of the actor he supported, but really signified this crucial shift and the beginning of the escalation towards a crude nationalism that would threaten the basic Zionist premises and the sources of legitimacy. This ambivalence and this kind of sensitivity to what I sometimes call Berlin's sensitivity to value conversions, how noble ideas can transform themselves into very ugly, violent practices, is something that Berlin will take from that stage on into his history of ideas. And this is not a coincidence that many times what you will see Berlin saying, for instance, about the difference between Alexander Herzen, the socialist revolutionary that was not willing to cross this thin red line and sacrifice humans for the sake of noble ideas, and Bakunin and other revolutionaries who were willing to break eggs to make an omelet. This is a lot of the sensitivity comes from this very specific Zionist background. And this is where I would like to start moving to the kind of a philosophical argument that I have to say about what Berlin's love affair with Zionism can tell us. And as we saw, it's not a simple love affair. It was never enthusiastic or passionate. In a way, one can argue that it was more in Zionism that Berlin rejected in frustration than accepted with zeal. But exactly because it was not Zionism that was grounded in unquestioning enthusiasm, he really had to come with a new idea of how to combine his liberalism with Zionism. And this is where I want to kind of say a few words about the way Berlin, the post-war Berlin, starts to think about the concept of liberty and how it's related to his personal story. How can I connect these two stories together, and what's the relationship between them? My key argument is really that if you want to see the first essays and the first lectures and the first text in which Berlin starts to formulate a new conception of freedom, it's actually not in his formally academic philosophical publications, but in his speeches, lectures, and popular articles on the Zionist question. And this is where he will start to develop a new concept of liberty that I call an opportunity concept. What is exactly understanding of liberty as an opportunity concept? And this is not my own term. I borrow it from political philosophers like Charles Taylor and Tom Baldwin. But the concept of freedom as an opportunity concept describes freedom as a certain condition in which one is hindered by a minimum possible constraints on the range of the choices that are available to him. If you want to put it in Berlin's own words, the more avenues men can enter, the broader those avenues, the more avenues that each opens into, the freer they are, argued Berlin. Now, I don't want to go into the fine details, the fine print of the philosophical argument. Of course, what Berlin would later call negative freedom and opportunity concept are not exactly the same thing, but the emphasis on the absence of obstacles, because it is guaranteeing a free exercise of choice, is the crucial point in my argument. This is, in the sense, what makes the free choice and the opportunity one of the preconditions for any individual to be free in the Berlinian philosophical sense. Now, interestingly, the place in which we find Berlin first using this concept of freedom as an opportunity concept in the most sophisticated way is actually in Berlin's 1951 essay for the Jewish Chronicle, Jewish Slavery and Emancipation, which is actually a bold pro-Zionist manifesto. And it was written, of course, after the State of Israel was established, but one of the key arguments that Berlin presented in that tract was, in order to legitimize Zionism, was based exactly on this opportunity concept. And I will read only a short excerpt from this essay. The creation of the State of Israel has rendered the greatest service that any human institution can perform for individual. It has restored to Jews not merely their personal dignity and status as human beings, but what is vastly more important, their right to choose as individuals how they shall live. The basic freedom of choice, the right to live or to perish, go to the good or the bad in one's own way, without which life is a form of slavery, as it has been, indeed, for the Jewish community for almost 2,000 years. This corresponds very well Berlin's own Cold War liberalism. Because totalitarianism began to be defined by him as, I quote, the denial to human beings of the possibility of choice. And Zionism was exactly the opposite. This was the political movement that created a new situation in which the modern Jew has several paths to choose to follow, more than one alternative. More choice means more freedom. And this, Berlin started to argue, was the cardinal achievement of Zionism. So we see actually that Berlin's opportunity concept crystallized and took shape exactly out of these personal dilemmas and ideological queries he experienced in the 1940s. And the formula that he presented in Jewish Slavery and Emancipation really predates Berlin's philosophical writings. He will use the term negative freedom only years later. So if you want, philosophically speaking, opportunity concept is the condition sine qua non of negative freedom. That's the essential element, a preliminary condition to achieve negative freedom. But historically speaking, this was the beginning of the intellectual voyage that led Berlin eventually to think about freedom as a negative concept. It is not a coincidence that this is written after 1948, because Berlin actually used this essay also to react against what he started to identify as a very crude new type of Zionist argument, an either-or argument that says that with the foundation of the State of Israel, all the Jews have a moment of truth and they need to decide. Either be Jews and then make Aliyah and move to Israel and become citizens of the new Jewish Republic, or assimilate, distinguish themselves. And the implication, and one of the most vocal proponents of this idea was no other than Arthur Koestler. And I mentioned this also to show you how much the Cold War liberals, that are so many things they agreed on their anti-communism was similar. When it came to the question of the Jewish nation and the Jewish nation state, this was actually a poignant source of debate. And Arthur Koestler was probably the most vocal to start arguing along this line, either or, complete assimilation or Aliyah to Israel. For the Berlinian opportunity concept is where it comes in exactly here. The rigid either-or formula that Koestler and others offered, argued Berlin, took Jews exactly to square one. It eliminated the new contribution that Zionism made to the world Jewry in general, the possibility of choice. And to argue the Koestlerian argument is actually not very different than forcing Jews to live in segregated ghettos in a new ways. So you can really see here the Berlin formula of freedom in action. Freedom is identified with a range of possible or alternative courses of action. It's an opportunity concept rather than what philosophers like to call an exercise concept. The reduction of plural possible courses of action to a single legitimate life pattern, Berlin would argue, was therefore what is not different, what makes crude Zionism not very different from totalitarianism. Now, this is an argument that is not the classical that thinkers that we would call nowadays neo-Republican thinkers in political philosophy will not agree with, and this is really part of the new contribution of Berlin to the liberal philosophy of the post-war, and I won't go into this. But what I want to finish with is really with the question whether this is actually, was this kind of the systematic solution, or were there dilemmas, the dilemmas resolved? And actually, like the type of formula that I recognize here, and I call in the book Berlin's Diaspora Zionism, was actually a formula that was never really theoretically explicated or explained by Berlin, a bit like Berlin's own theory of value pluralism. And in the context of our lecture, I would like simply to finish by reminding you that the personal ambivalence and the existential dilemma remained. And Berlin's post-war writings, you can find him still conceiving Jewishness as deformity, still as a mental condition of the diaspora Jew. In Jewish Slavery Emancipation, he went as far as to compare the condition of the Jew to the condition of a hunchback, saying that the hunchback it's a biological given trait, and the only question is how you deal with your hunch. You either conceal it, you either hide it, or in the contrary, you're proud about it. And Zionism, he argued, was still the only surgical operation that takes this hunch off. Berlin was right, and it is marvelous that Israelis have developed a normal life, Berlin would write after the war. Israelis are perfectly ordinary human beings who do not suffer from the particular neurosis which the Zionist movement was intended to cure. And shows you how little he knew about real Israelis. And he repeatedly argued this: the citizens of Israel are a nation among nations, and their virtues and vices are not products of some sort of abnormal social distortion. But he started at the same time to argue that there was a price Jews paid for this enchanting mental metamorphosis. The Jewish genius, Berlin began to argue, was actually a gift to humanity by a suffering people living in these abnormal conditions. Jews, with their rich and extraordinary history, miraculous survivors from the classical age of our common civilization, that this fascinating people should choose to give up its unique status? And for what? To become Albania? How could they want this? The Alexander Kujev asked Berlin. Berlin's reply to the Russian-French philosopher was sharp. However, and that's my last quote, however it might look to the world in general, to condemn the oyster for wishing to avoid the suffering that led to the disease that might, in some cases, result in a pearl was neither reasonable nor just. The oyster wished to live an oyster's life, to realize itself as an oyster, not solely to serve as an unhappy means of enriching the world with masterpieces of art or philosophy or religion that sprang from its suffering. Berlin adored the Israelis for being not racked by self-consciousness, wondering uneasily what they look like to the other, by over-anxiety to please suspicious fellow citizens. At the same time, he feared that Jews, all Jews, would become like them. To paraphrase Kujev, as much as Berlin wanted Israel to become normal, down-to-earth state like Albania, he feared the idea that Jews, all Jews, would become nothing but Albanians. And I apologize if there are Albanians in the crowd today. At the end of the day, Berlin could not see himself abandoning European culture for a Levantine life. Being appointed to the Order of Merit and holding prestigious position, including that of the President of the British Academy, did not extinguish Berlin's perception of himself as an outsider. The dilemmas and the paradoxes were never resolved. As much as he was adored and honored by the British establishment, he kept insisting on having what he called a sense of social unease due to the fact that nowhere do Jews feel entirely at home. The social unease and Jewish sense of homelessness were, for Berlin, at once symptoms of an illness and preconditions for a prodigy. Thank you.